Welcome back to those of you that joined the series so far and experienced the My Life, My Business and This Sector sessions, and a very, very warm welcome to those of you that have joined for the first time today. This is the fourth of 5 BRC learning webinars exploring the impact of COVID-19 on our lives, our businesses, our sector, our world and our purpose. For those of you that didn't get the chance to see the 3 sessions that we've already run, these are available to watch in our bank of support resources, and I will talk to you more about these at the end of today's webinar. We are delighted that so many of you have joined, considering the restrictions that have changed in retail this week, and I could see just before I went live that we were rounding around 100 people, so thank you very much for coming along. My name is Sam Redman. I'm the Programme Designer of the OSS Retail Academy Programme, and along with Rob Husband, who you've already heard from, we will be hosting your sessions today. We hope that you've taken the time to watch our introduction video that explains a little bit more about what this webinar entails, but essentially we are creating an environment of recovery and discovery through community and collaboration. Throughout our webinar series, we have been joined by members of the BRC team, and today is no different. In a moment, I will be handing to Terry Lees, who's the Head of Leadership Development and Learning Events at the BRC. Terry will today be introducing our keynote animator for the Our World webinar. So Terry, if you'd like to unmute yourself, it is over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Sam. I'm delighted to be with you all this afternoon as we continue to explore the impact that COVID-19 has on our lives. When we put together this webinar series, a reaction to the challenges that retail continues to face, we did so with the specific objective of creating a safe, collaborative space so that as leaders, as human leaders, we could come together to share our insights and experiences on the impact that the changing world is having on us. The devastating events of the last few weeks have demonstrated just how important this is. It's absolutely crucial for us to come together as a community to discuss the difficult issues that we continue to face, no matter how uncomfortable that may be. As a white middle-class leader, I understand more than ever that I have a bigger part to play in recognizing and challenging the blight of racism in all forms so that I can positively impact society. It is no longer enough. In truth, it was never enough to simply think of myself as not being a racist, that I was doing everything I could for this fight. I must do more. In my early career, I worked for a business that had a leadership principle that seems to be appropriate here. Responsibility is a privilege. I don't think there has ever been a more important time for us to understand that privilege as leaders of people experiencing extreme changes. Before I introduce today's animator keynote speaker, I want to reflect briefly on this point of responsibility. I believe that it is our responsibility collectively to work together to change our society for the future. At the heart of this change is education. Personally, I know I have work to do to eradicate my own unconscious bias. I will also continue to work collaboratively to create more positive change. So on the note of education, and more importantly, inclusion, I am thrilled to be in a position to welcome today's guest to explore the impact on our world. For those of you who are familiar with our Academy programme, you will also be very familiar with Paul Anderson-Walsh and the team from the Centre of Inclusive Leadership. Paul and the team have been facilitating and leading the Recognising Your Potential part of the Academy for many years now. Paul is the co-founder of the Centre and the former chair of the Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust. Paul, please unmute yourself. Now it's over to you.
Thank you. Have I come through now? Good. All right. Well, firstly, good afternoon. I cannot tell you how thrilled I am to be with you. And it was really interesting in the lead up to this that Rob just encouraged us into a kind of moment of reflection. I thought that was fascinating, Rob, for all sorts of different reasons. And then when Terry came and framed the session, it kind of compounded the thought in my mind that it was right to pause, to reflect, because I think that we're going to talk about something today that around the subject of leadership, and I'll talk to you more about, for those of you particularly who don't think you're leaders, I'll talk a bit more about it in a moment. But I really do think that we are kind of standing on holy ground at the moment. This is such an unusual time. I've been around for a long time and been involved in any number of things, and have certainly seen all kinds of interesting conversations, particularly around the subjects of race and race inequality. And more of that I can surely tell you if you like. But this is a very, very peculiar and I think very special time. So I want to use the time that you've granted me to perhaps provoke something of a conversation with you, really. I've got quite a straightforward structure for how I'd like to facilitate this session, which might be a little different from the ones that you've done so far, but hopefully it'll work for you. But really 3 points, I guess. I want to provide you with some structure and some context, because I want to talk to you about this notion of what I'm calling a tale of 2 pandemics. I want to talk to you about that. I want to set up a couple of very focused conversations, which I think will hopefully be able to give you an ability to move into some action orientation. And then I want to suggest a way forward. And so at the end, Rob, I hope we'll have the space for me to suggest a way forward for you as a sector. Because I think in a very real sense, you as the retail sector are the people that set the trends. There is no doubt, if I was to do it at a simple level, you tell us what to wear, you tell us what to watch, you tell us what to sit on, you tell us everything. And I think this is an opportunity for you particularly to take the lead. But this isn't about marketing. What we're talking about today is about meaning. And it's about telling us and showing us and modeling for us a way of being that we all want to imitate. So let me perhaps give you a bit of context, and then we'll kind of get into the sort of thread of what I've got in my mind. So I think in an article that I wrote for you, a little blog I wrote pre this, I called it the 2 pandemics, a paradigm shift and a panacea. And let me just quickly explain to you what I had in my mind. The story we find ourselves in is a very unusual story indeed. Who could have thought as we arrived in 2020 that we would be in the situation we're in right now? What are the pandemics? Well, we're clear that COVID-19 is a pandemic. Everybody would understand that. And I think if you are alive to what's going on in the world, then you might be prepared to describe racism as perhaps covert-19. But that is no longer covert, because it's become brutally apparent that there is a structural problem that is not confined to the United States of America. It is a global problem, that if you are a Black person, your outcomes are going to be less than. And that is something that is truly difficult to countenance. And for reference, it's worth saying to you, I have an unusual position to be able to mediate this from, because I have the privilege of being both Black and white. So I sit across this conversation in a way that perhaps a lot of mixed race people like me will understand. And there's more to say about that at another time. The paradigm shift we're in is interesting. I think these pandemics, and I'll talk about how I think they become entangled in a moment, but the paradigm shift is interesting because this is happening in the midst of the 4th industrial revolution. We have moved, and it seems to be at breakneck speed, from a thing called the internet to the Internet of Things. We have moved from my generation, who are the early adopters, the digital immigrants, as we might be, to watching my grandchildren who are digital natives. And what you're seeing in the world right now is you're seeing Generation Z say, This is just simply not acceptable. And these are the digital people who are going to lead our world. And you need to be very clear. These are the people that are going to be leading our world moving forward. And the panacea is this. The panacea I'm going to suggest to you is this notion of inclusion. And it's going to be important, I think, for us to be able to make the differentiation between the kind of languages we use in a very throwaway, interchangeable way. We talk about diversity and equality and inclusion, and we speak about them as if they were interchangeable terms, and frankly, they're really not. To be clear, diversity is just difference. So if you had two white middle-class twins who went to Eton and then went on to Oxford and married two white middle-class twins who were at equally appropriate schools and then went on to Cambridge as well, they would still be diverse on the basis of there's two of them. It's just difference. The issue about inclusion, or indeed let's do with equality first, the notion of equality and equal opportunity legislation is about protecting my right to be different. But even in an industry like yours that values difference, you're not guaranteed to get any value from difference unless and until you essentially manage people's inclusion. And inclusion is not a thing, it's not a statistic, it's not a metric. Inclusion is about the way I feel. It's about how I experience you. It's about, do I feel like I fit? Do I feel like I can belong here? And belonging and unbelonging are the great issues of our day, particularly in the context of COVID-19 and isolation. There's a workbench, and it's a bit crude, so forgive me for it. It's a fairly crude workbench that I use with my team at the moment as we're looking at how we're supporting our clients who come from all sorts of sectors, yours and banking and finance and government and education and charitable sectors all across the space. And we're looking at what we think is happening. And the crude workbench, essentially, we talk about this notion of what we call from lockdown to liftoff. And if I was to map this for you, I think it's a reasonable interpretation of where we are and the future in which we're stepping into. We're now in the lockdown phase. I'm sure you retailers will be delighted to know we're finally coming out of that, because goodness knows how you've managed to fare in the midst of that. But for sure, in this period we see between June and December, there is still a lot of remote working. I think that will be something we'll talk more about, but certainly that will be an ongoing thing. But I think the really big issue for organizations is this issue about retention. And I think the retention issue is going to be a very serious problem for organizations, because the one thing about having time on your hands for the 10-odd million people that are furloughed is this is an opportunity now to reevaluate. And the reevaluation, and I think you're going to pick this up in your next seminar, Terry, is about purpose, about your why. And the question of why and what I do is a very significant question, I think. And so we're going to see a lot of issues around retention, and we're going to see issues around right sizing, of course. When we finally move into 2021, what we're envisaging is a kind of first half of a year that's about returning, of course, people being reintegrated back into the workplace. There's going to be all sorts of issues around risk and regulation. It's unimaginable to me, thinking about some of my investment banking clients, that we have people trading the country's wealth in their kitchens right now. I mean, it was just an unthinkable that you'd be able to do that, but of course you can. But then there's going to be a big issue about re-engagement, about how we re-engage everybody. That's going to be a big, big conversation. And then as we move into toward the end of the year, we're going to be thinking about the notion of retention, reinvention. As you, in your rather nice way of talking about it, you talk about the idea of moving from recovery to discovery. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing. So we land up here in 2022, we think, to what might be something like a new normal. And I think you will have to accept that we have seen irrevocable change. I think COVID has brought irrevocable change to the way we are being. And I think the Floyd issue, and I make no apology for this, which I think brought us to a place of quantum entanglement, is going to mean that that is an absolutely irrevocable change too. But it's strange, isn't it? Because if you think, having been locked down since the 23rd of March, it's kind of hard to imagine. It was only in 2014 that the request for flexible working for all employees was extended in the UK. So it was just literally 6 years ago. But stranger even to think that it was just 3 years before that, when the fourth industrial revolution was birthed. And now there's been a reluctance, I think, to grasp that. But now COVID has changed all that. COVID has kind of catapulted us into the future now. And I think the reality is that not only did COVID-19 literally induce the birth of communicating, I think the really big point was not just so much the telecommuting has been an issue, but I think it literally cut the umbilical cord between the worker and the workplace forever. And the big feature, I think, of the fourth industrial revolution is this, is work is no longer somewhere you go, it's what you do. And that's important because now we're living in a world where you might say to yourself, well, you know what? Have laptop, why travel? Why do I need to go anywhere? Why do I need to come into the city? And I think you're going to find that more and more city dwellers will abandon the cities in search of the quality of life in the provinces and spend more of their disposable income probably online. So COVID may well be the catalyst, and I think it is, but I think the killing of George Floyd will prove to be the midwife. I wrote an article recently on that was published on LinkedIn, it's published on our website, called Waiting to Exhale. And I talk about this moment of literal quantum entanglement where these two ideas have become completely fused together. And it's created something very unusual. And my history of structural inequality in this country goes back a very long way. I'm a child of the 60s. I was born to a Jamaican father and an Irish mother, and it wasn't too long before my Jamaican father and my Irish mother decided they weren't going to actually have a future together. And I was raised in what was called a Rackman house, and those were the only houses that Irish women with black children could be raised in, because there's signs on the windows of places like Notting Hill, where I was raised, said no blacks, no dogs, and no Irish. So I've seen a lot of conversations over the years, whether it's Scarman or whether it's the result of the Macpherson report and the murder of Stephen Lawrence, whether it's the Scarman from the Brixton riots or whatever it might be. We've seen a lot, but there's something different about this, and I think it really is different. And I tell you what I think is different. I think that we've reached a point where, let me say this to you, where white people are listening to us. But what's important is, I don't think white people are just listening to us. I think for the first time in my memory, white people are listening as us. And it's that ability to listen as us that is so unusual, because I think what's happened here is, I think this double injustice, this dual pandemic has been able to penetrate the surface consciousness and has actually really hit the core of what I would call our human-heartedness. Because this, what we've witnessed, particularly in the Floyd instance, and as many other instances that I could point you to, is an attack on our fundamental moral sensibility. And there is at our root, beneath the surface, beneath the noise, beneath all of the theatre and the appearances, I believe there is this deep appreciation and reverence for human value. And human-heartedness, when it's touched, always manifests itself in interpersonal love and care when treating other people. So for me, the quantum entanglement of Floyd and COVID have literally lifted us to that place. And I think it's important to introduce the panacea, because if you take the two ideas of the two pandemics, and you'll accept those from me, and you'll take the fourth industrial revolution as the paradigm shift, the panacea, I believe, is inclusion. Because inclusion is this mystical moment, and I use the word advisedly. It's that mystical moment when suddenly them becomes us. When suddenly there is no sense of us and them, in and out, up and down, left and right, right and wrong. It is the end of duality, and we just see that there is just us. And that is a very profound moment to arrive at, and I believe it is exactly where we've arrived at. I wrote at length about this in the Waiting to Exhale article, and by all means, I'm happy to, if we want to make that available to folks, please do. But it's really important, because this has happened at a time when we're supposed to be all in it together. And there has suddenly been an awakening, I think, where you've realized we're not all in it together. We don't have even starting points. Black people face headwinds that white people simply have no idea about. You just have no concept of it. And it's not something we can even explain to you. But the notion of inclusion is the thing for me that brings hope. I think that the really important piece, and why I feel so reverential to talk to you about this today, is that we have to make a decision about what sort of people we want to be and what sort of world we want to live in when we emerge from this crisis. But the problem is, there is another crisis that is going on that no one's addressed, no one's seeking to remedy, but we have the ability to do something about it. There is a crisis of leadership right across the world. In the highest of office, there is a problem, a fundamental problem with leadership. And I'll tell you this, if leadership is to have a future, then there will need to be a leadership renewal. And our leaders of the future will need to be those men and women, those people that are able to demonstrate loving leadership in a world where their employees are perceived as being their volunteers. There is a different world coming, and I'm telling you, the Generation Z people that you are seeing driving this outrage against racism, these are the people that have this innately in them, inside of themselves. Let me show you something very quickly, and I'm conscious I want to get you into your breakout rooms and the conversations that we want to have, but let me show you something. There's some work been done by Professor Ian Buchan at Liverpool, which I think is very interesting. And Buchan talks about these 4 waves. Let me just quickly show you them. And they're very interesting, actually, because these are the footprints of the pandemic, and this is over time. So the first wave that we've all experienced is the immediate mortality and morbidity of COVID-19. So we all know about that. And we've had conversation after conversation, haven't we, about the R rate and how you flatten the R rate and what you've got to do to flatten the R rate. Well, we're seeing that R rate now ease and be flattened some, hence the reopening of retail and so forth, and hopefully more uneasing of the lockdown as we go, easing rather. But then we saw that there's a tail to that. There's the ICU recovery wave. But then there's this second wave that's come through, and that second wave is a big issue because that has a big impact on resource and restriction for non-urgent, non-COVID cases. So that becomes very problematic. And then this third wave is about the interrupted care on chronic conditions. So read the statistics, you'll know for yourself, we've already got 10 million operations backed up. Now you can't back up 10 million operations and think that's going to be okay, because it's not going to be okay, because that's going to have a consequence. But the wave that Buchan's pointing to, which is the one I would particularly point you to, because we have the ability to do something about this particular wave, is this 4th wave. And this 4th wave has been a silent one, and it's moving, and it's been with us pre-COVID, by the way. It's about psychic trauma, it's about mental illness, it's about economic injury, and it's about burnout. And we are going to have to keep our eyes very much on this, because there's a lot of stuff that's going to happen that will not be, you will be working around to kind of social distance and all that good stuff. But please keep your eye on this 4th wave, because it's very, very serious. And the question we've got to ask ourselves, particularly when it comes to the people that we lead and manage, is this: how does, and I will offer this to you, how does inclusive leadership support you in addressing performance continuity in the light of these 2 pandemics? Well, I think there are some very big questions that you're going to have to deal with. I think you're going to have to ask yourself about whether or not people that are working with you feel psychologically safe. Do I actually feel able to be candid about how I'm really feeling? It's a very big question. What about my health and well-being? How do we know if our employees are suffering in silence? What about the issue of social isolation? Are we doing enough to ensure that although we're apart, we still feel a part? And what about this business about change readiness? How are our people doing with that? Because these changes are unprecedented and they are absolutely fundamental. And candidly, are we actually doing enough to support people in this new way of working? And I think those are big questions that are not only questions for HR business partners and L&D practitioners, they're questions for the entire organization to be asking, because these are serious, serious issues. And if we don't get these right, that 4th wave will make the others look ridiculous. So let me talk quickly about this, the flattening the R rate, because I think that's worth just saying, because these 2 pandemics have a very interesting relationship, I think. We've heard an awful lot, haven't we, from government about the business of how we go about flattening the COVID-19 R rate. So we know a lot about that. And I want to suggest to you that actually the secret here is interesting, that if we're going to tackle these two dual pandemics, then we need to tackle them in actually rather interesting and contrary ways. Let me show you what I think has to happen. In COVID-19, the advice is wear a mask. If we're going to deal with the problem of covert racism, then we need to take off our metaphorical masks. That's the first thing we have to do. With COVID-19, we're supposed to cover up. If we're going to deal with racism, we've got to stop covering and face the uncomfortable truths. With COVID-19, we've got to literally limit our contact with other people. If we're going to deal with racism, we've got to increase our connection with people who are other. When we're talking about COVID, we're supposed to stay at home as much as possible. When we're talking about dealing with racism, we've got to find ways of coming together. When we're thinking about the whole notion of COVID, we're talking about making sure you keep your distance. When you're talking about dealing with structural racism, you've got to reduce the psychological distance that sits between us. When you're talking about COVID, if anyone in your household has symptoms, you all need to self-isolate. If you're talking about dealing with racism, we need to come to an end of seeing ourselves in isolation. We've got to stop doing that. When it comes to COVID, we have something called PPE, personal protective garments, and they're equipment that's designed to protect the wearer's body from injury or infection, and very important they are too. When it comes to racism, there's a different type of PPE. That's about principles and not pragmatism. It's about people, not profit. It's about equity, not exclusion. It's about a way of being designed to protect others from that injury and that infection. And when we come to talk about COVID, the advice is wash your hands regularly. But let me tell you something, when it comes to this business of racism, nobody can wash their hands. We need to all deal with it. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to encourage us to get into some groups and have a conversation. And the conversation I would like us to have is a conversation about how we make the shift from if to since. So and we're going to pose two questions for you. We'll do them in two different breakout sessions, but they go like this. The first thing to own here is this. You don't have to be at the center of an organization to lead it. You have to be at the heart of it. And that's important to understand that, because leadership is not about a position, it's about influence. It's about a way of being. So as leaders, however you want to define that in retail, how can you ensure that you're able to say that since we did, we've begun to address the structural inequality instead of if only we had? How do you do that? So let me ask you to go into your groups with this first question, and it's this. The I in the if proposition is I is for insight. So what I'd like you to take into your breakouts would be this. What have you learned about yourself throughout this period that you recognized as something you'll either want to disrupt or develop if you want to make yourself an even better inclusive leader? So what's going on for you at a personal level that either you need to disrupt or you need to develop that will contribute to making you an even better inclusive leader? So Rob, let me hand over to you to facilitate this however you would like to.
Okay, cool. So thank you, Paul. Lots to think about. Just for those of you who've been on these before, what we're going to do, we're going to put you into some discussion rooms. There'll be about 4 or 5 people in each room. In a minute, you will get an invite to join a room. Can you please click on the join little button when it appears? When you get into the group, we're going to have about 15 minutes to respond to Paul's question. You'll get reminders of the question at the time through that discussion group. And just remember as you go in, when you're going to start talking, just say your name and the organization you work for. Don't worry about your position or your role. We're here as equals, and we're here as human beings together, learning together. So again, just a reminder, stay focused on the conversation and listen well. So listen well to each other. You've all got a unique view and a unique experience to share. So I think Jag should have all the invites up and ready. You may have some group leaders or ADs in there, and they will have a GL or an AD before their name. They're not going to take over. They're just there to listen. Okay, so don't wait for them, because we're not sure what groups they're going to be in, but just they might be there as a member just to listen to what's happening. And then when we come out, if you can start putting things onto the chat, and Paul will start to pick up some of the responses that are happening on the chat. So as you come back into the room, be great if you can just start putting some comments up on the chat about your responses to that question, and Paul will make a little bit of a response to those. It'd be just great. So what are the key things that you heard others say? What were the key things, the themes that started to appear? So if you can go to the chat and start adding some of the stuff, that'd be great. Yeah, some issues around so we're moving into this new way of working. What's it like to separate work and life when they are both joined in a different way or in a new way? How can we make a difference in our company through recruitment? It's about speaking out more. Yeah, can we maybe bravery or courage? Yeah, so there's some of the maybe the benefits that we've experienced of this new ways of having to work, and what we're going to lose when we go back into something that is again different. Being able to reset the lens. Oh, you're starting to go really quick now. Ooh. Embracing and feeling comfortable with feeling uncomfortable. Yeah, there's some uncomfortable conversations happening around the world. How can we be comfortable in feeling that uncomfortable, embracing them? And how do I educate and learn myself? Keeping people engaged, enthusiastic when they return. Yeah, and how do we have uncomfortable or challenging meetings on a 15-inch screen? How do we have these conversations?
Rob, I really like this question from this point from Scott. This piece about understanding more about people's heritage, beliefs, and their life, to be able to understand them better. I think that's going to be such a theme moving forward, that we take time to literally understand. I think that's a great observation. I do like that notion about creating an environment where people are going to want to come back to. I think that's wonderful as well. Allow emotions is good. Very good. Listen harder. That's a good call. Yeah, there's a nice Rob. There's a nice point here about thinking about the humanistic leadership qualities in our business rather than business knowledge. I think that's a very, very astute point. I think that Michelle, I think it was your point. I think that a lot of organisations, candidly, are overmanaged and underled, and I think that we really forget at our peril that ultimately we're leading people and not machines. We're leading people, and I think that's a really good call out. And this is the same idea that Evelina's pulling out, the shift in leadership role from control and command to empowering and enabling. Brilliant. It's a great call.
And there's something else in there, Paul, about sort of the vulnerability of leadership, and that senior leaders being open, and actually I'll share my life, I'll share my story.
I think that's right. Yeah. I think that's so important, actually, because that notion of being transparent and vulnerable, I think, is going to be a really, really big piece. I've got much to say on that, but perhaps we'll keep that for another day. But I like this. It's very good. Yeah, Michael makes a nice point there, actually. The almost irony of how having more personal connection with our colleagues by seeing them in their home situations, their families, their pets, etc., even though we don't currently have physical connection with them. See, that's a good point, Michael, because actually it's not about being in the same space together. It's about sharing experiences together. And I think that's something I think we've not quite captured, but that's a good call out.
It all feels like, Paul, that removes that false barrier sometimes we have about I am this person at home and I'm this person at work. All of a sudden we've got a window into that in a different way.
Well, I think that's right. And I think there's an interesting opportunity for authenticity in that space as well. I mean, I think it's got some other issues that follow through it, but at the same time, I think it comes with some really, really powerful, that's a powerful thought. I really like that. I really do. Ah, there we are, my friend Shane McCardle. Well, no surprise of wisdom from you, Mr. McCardle. How do we bottle the good things that happened in lockdown? Faster decision, more agility, and ensure that we don't lose that ability and when we arrive at the new normal. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Couldn't agree. Catherine's making a nice point about education needs review. I wholeheartedly agree with that. Wholeheartedly. Andy's making a nice point about being able to reset the lens through which you previously looked and challenge the vast amounts of information you're faced with. Nice. Empower Mina's point, empowering others, empowering our teams to help themselves and be part of the bigger picture. Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Lucy makes a nice point because I think there's a real tension here, Lucy, between my personal well-being is being better at home, but I miss the interaction with my team. So I'm beyond. So I'm torn. And I think what you're calling out there, Lucy, actually is an interesting dilemma because I think that leadership is a combination of two things. I think it's a combination of voice and touch. And I think what we're getting more of in the virtual environment is we're getting more voice. But what we're not getting at the level that you're talking about is we're not getting touch at the same level. And I think that's an interesting problem, which is why I don't suppose that this will be, concretized in virtual work. But although I do think, by the way, I do think there will be a whole new level of, we used to talk about white collar and blue collar. I think the reality of this is that with the paradigm shift, there'll be another category you might call no collar. And I think those people will have to really figure this out, how they do the social interaction, because you can bet your life the future for high density office blocks is not good. I promise you. I can't see that anytime soon. So it's an interesting chat. Some good stuff, Rob. Really good stuff. Really, really nice.
Just aware we've just got a couple of minutes and then we're going to go into, Paul's going to introduce another question. Just one of the things I've noticed as people are putting these things up on the chat, that there's something about people have, it's scary to have these conversations. It's uncomfortable. And there's something around about, taking risk and some bravery and about, empowering our teams to open up completely without judgment. Well, that requires me or us as leaders to be different. To create that space where judgment doesn't happen. So it feels like there's an invite for us to behave differently.
I think that's right. And I think, Rob, the really big piece that I would take out from that is it's about the performance continuity thing I talked about earlier on. And I think the number one job is that we've got to be able to create psychologically safe spaces for people. That is so important. I love Carly's point about listen twice and speak once. Carly, I was told this by my first ever manager. I never forgot it. So I'm loving you saying this. We were given 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Yes, my old boss used to say, and young man, you need to use those in proportion. Something took me a few years to figure out, but it's a great piece of advice. Nice point, Carly. Really nice.
Okay, yeah, and Paul, have you got your second question?
Yeah, I do. Let me just hide the chat screen. Sorry, if I may. Yeah, so that's been super, really interesting. So let's press on then. And if the I was about insight, then the F is about foresight. So what I'm wanting you to think about in the foresight question is this, is that what can you anticipate that you and your organization will need to, what's the construction of this question, be, have and do to meet the needs of all of us, not just some of us in the post-COVID Floyd world?
This time we're going to go in for 10 minutes. We will sort of post up the question and we'll give you a reminder of times again. So what can you anticipate you or your organization will need to be, have and do to meet the needs of all of us and not just some of us in the post-COVID Floyd world? So you should have an invite to join those discussion groups. And again, we'll see you in 10 minutes. Yeah, so some people are starting to put up some comments on the chat. That'd be great. Just some ideas about what was talked about. So be aware of unconscious bias and disrupt it. That feels like an action. Let's take an action around this. So other thoughts, ideas, responses. Be open, be courageous, and be a role model. Yeah, so this sense of, community, how can we collaborate I mean, but part of the purpose of this program is about collaborating through community. So how can we do that? It's relevant for both COVID and Floyd. So those both pandemics.
Some powerful stuff on here, Rob, and this notion from Theo's brilliant. Don't wait for a policy change. Drive the change you want to see.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a great point, because I think that don't look to the other person. Do it in your own space. That's super. That's really, really good. Yeah, Liz is right. There are a lot of companies putting teams together to look into this. That's exactly right. People have the right attitude. Nice. Yeah, you're a leader, says Kate, not because of the title you're given you. You lead through action and living your truths. Here to that.
Yeah.
Engage without people outside of the usual circles. Nice. Really nice. Be more empathetic. Some great stuff. I just think, you know, I just think if there was ever an industry that's wired to this, to understand this, it's retail. I really do. It's just so interesting reading this. I think that if I may say so, and I don't mean this in any sense in anything other than an entirely complimentary way, I think kindness comes more naturally to this industry than certain others I work in. It doesn't come so kindly in investment banking and various other places I can think of. It's very, very interesting. Very interesting. Speak out, absolutely. Yeah. So there's Joe's saying very, very brave stuff, Joe. Thank you for sharing this. Speak out. I, for one, have challenges within my own family that I choose not to engage with because our views are very different. Start the conversation, take the risk. Scary territory, absolutely. Great point. Great point. Educating ourselves, yeah. Address the elephant in the room, absolutely. Set quotas. Now that's an interesting shout, Catherine. Even if less experienced staff are appointed, it will tell you the thing that's really interesting is that the whole idea of cognitive diversity is fascinating. When you start to allow other people to think freely for themselves, the kind of stuff you get is really very interesting. Yeah, look at what you see. I think there's a real point about, Catherine's making the point about 360 degrees. I've got a real problem with those, you know, because I think that there's a real fundamental problem about asking people questions. It's only worth asking people questions if A, they know the answer, and B, they're prepared to tell you the truth. So actually we've got to do better on that, because I think that we do need better data. There's no doubt about that.
And I feel like that links to that thing earlier about the non-judgment, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure. I love Anna's point. Create lollipop moments where you can inspire somebody. I love that. I don't know what a lollipop moment is, but I'm loving the idea. I love that. It's brilliant. Please tell us what a lollipop was. Anna, forgive me for being stupid, because I want to know. That's a great expression. I'm sure I'm going to use it all over the place once I understand what it means. It's really nice. The power of one. Yeah, that's a nice point, Mina. It's a beautiful point. Creating spaces to see voices and opinions from many people, other communities, races, cultures, backgrounds. Yeah, this is the whole point. Angie's point is unity has so much power. Absolutely. Carly, stop diluting the content. Yes, exactly right, Carly. Be direct, be transparent. No, that's really, really strong. That's really strong. Really good. Some great stuff. Some great stuff. I'm wondering if that's Carly is my friend from Harrods, actually. I'm wondering if that's the Carly we've got on, in which case those comments wholeheartedly resonate even more, Carly. Brilliant. Some good stuff. Give more trust to teams, remove fear of failure. Yeah, I can share some. I can share some if you want to. There's a TED talk about it. Oh, I shall go and have a look about lollipop moments. I will do that. Oh, just by treating people nicely. Oh, good stuff. Like it. Got it, Anna. I've got it on board. Love it. Oh, not from Harrods, says Carly. Another Carly. Oh, there you go. Well, Carly's a smart lady. Oh, there we are. That's all I've got to say. Good. Love it.
Okay. Some great stuff coming up. And I think, you know, part of this seminar was about thinking about what place can retail have in the world that we want. I mean, how does it shape it? So that's about leadership, sector taking its leadership, and us as individuals taking leadership. Paul, we've got a few minutes at the end. Paul, how would you like to wrap this up for us?
So I tell you what I'd really like to do. I'd like, if I may, to kind of offer you something of let me put it this, a 4-point race agenda for retail. So I've got a bit of a thought about this that I'd like to just offer as a challenge to you as a community, really. I've already made the point that I think as people, we have an absolutely momentous choice to make. We really do have to decide what sort of people we want to be as we emerge from this crisis. We absolutely have to make that choice. So allow me, if you would, to make this challenge to this particular sector, and forgive me for grouping you in that way. I don't mean to stereotype you, but I want to try and find a collective way of talking about you. Look, you've seen through the chat, you've seen people talk in very practical ways about things that they can do, about taking responsibility, about whether it's lollipop moments, being the change, whatever it might be. We've seen that. And here's the point. There are only 3 possibilities in terms of actually bringing about structural change. And they're these. You want to fix it, but you can't. That's one option. You can fix it, but you don't want to. That's another option. And the third option is you can fix it and you will. And the reality is that you can fix it for your part of the world. I wish I had time to tell you or maybe I do, the story of the boy who stood by the beach, and there he is at the beach every morning, and he's doing this particular exercise where he seems to bend down, pick something up and throw something out, And the man walks past him on the cliffs and sees this young man every single day of his life. And he's intrigued by what this aerobic thing this kid seems to be doing is. So one morning he decides to wander down and to go and see what the boy's doing. And the boy is standing on the seashore, which is absolutely carpeted with starfish. And what the boy does in a single movement is he bends down and picks up a starfish and throws it into the sea. And then he bends down, picks up a starfish and throws another one into the sea. And the man says, "I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but I see you do this all the time. What are you doing?" And the young boy said, "I'm saving the starfish." So the man said to him, "But what difference can you make? This place is carpeted with starfish." And the boy bends down again and picks up another starfish and throws it into the sea and says, "Well, I made a difference to that one, didn't I?" And I think that's the point, that we can make a difference to that one, can't we? So the most common question that I get asked right now is how can I help? What can I do? So I wanted to suggest to you there might be a bit of a way of thinking about this 4-point agenda, and you may be able to make a better version of this than I have, but this is a way of thinking about it. I think the first thing we have to do is we have to reimagine our corporate governance. I think that has to be completely reimagined. I think we need to think very carefully about our culture, our values, and I think we need to ensure that they are designed in a way that benefit all of you, not just some of you. I think this is a huge issue. I think that in that reimagination, I think it's important that you ensure that you use robust measurement tools that can actually test the degree of what I call OCD within your organization. Organizations to a greater or lesser extent suffer from OCD, by which I mean organizational cognitive dissonance, which is the difference between what you say you believe and how you actually behave. And that gap has got to be closed. And I think there's something about ensuring that the rewards mechanisms, they essentially reward and incentivize the right behavior, and they disincentivize the wrong behavior. It's simply not good enough to say, oh, well, because that person gets good numbers, then we kind of turn a blind eye to their behavior. That's not acceptable. It's about not only what number did you get, it's about how did you get the number. And if you got the number in a way that violates the values of who you are in an organization, that doesn't count. So you just have to grip that and own that. So I think there's a real call to reimagine the way we think about our corporate governance, because the governance has to work for you as the folks who work within the sector, for us who engage with your sector at a customer level, for your shareholders, for your supply chain. It's got to work for everybody. And that's really important. And I think that for me, the A in my little model here is really about saying to you please do not abdicate responsibility. You can't do that. We are in Edmund Burke territory. And to paraphrase Burke, he said, nobody can make a greater mistake than he who does nothing because he thinks he can only do a little. And that's the starfish principle. We can all do something. And there needs to be a kind of a shift in our minds that will lift us from this this non-consciousness, not even unconscious, non-consciousness, to be consciously, absolutely laser focused on this notion of how we build more inclusive environments. I think there's something for me about building a new social compact. And I think this is important because I think this is about creating an environment where we know that it's psychologically safe. It was very interesting, the work that Google did on what makes teams successful in Google. They looked at the various different teams they had, and they concluded that some were more successful than others for various different reasons. And there were 5 particular reasons that they identified. But the number one reason that Google said is a characteristic of a successful team is this sense of psychological safety. And this is a big point. This is the ability to just put your hand out, knowing very well that you're not going to be, sneered at. It's not a question of, is it a good idea in some organizations? In some organizations, it's whose idea is it? But the notion of being able to raise ideas and bring thought and be fluid and not feel that everything has to be edited, because the reality is that what happens in an environment where we all, by the way, have a deep-seated need as people to belong. And what happens when we're living in an environment where we want to belong, what you'll see happens there, and it's very profound for us, is that we will figure out what we need to do to fit in. And many of us will edit, we will cover up, we'll hide parts of ourselves that we perceive to be stigmatized. And some of us will amputate parts of our personality, parts of our way of being, and end up in this horrifically inauthentic way of being. And I see it time and time and time again in organizations where we simply don't have the courage to be ourselves. And that is a deeply problematic idea. So for me, it's about saying, can we have a new social compact? And in that compact, what we do is we don't simply value diversity. We don't just value difference, but we know how to get value from diversity. We know how to get it because wired into our culture is this notion that everybody in our space hears. What do I mean by that? I mean that they hear and they listen to one another, alive to the fact that we all have bias, but we all have prejudgments. And by the way, there's a difference between prejudgment and discrimination. Everybody has bias. Discrimination is, what happens with discrimination is, a bias is something that I might not be aware of, a prejudgment that surfaces, but the skillful people know how to interrupt that so that the prejudgment doesn't then become discriminating behavior to another person. So there is a real piece to be done there. But this second piece is the piece that I'll pick up in the last part, in my E really, which is about this ability to treat people equally well. But the organization that hears not only listens and knowing that they're listening through the filter of their own bias and they learn how to interrupt it, they make the shift, if you will, from unconscious bias to a place of conscious inclusion. And the important point is they get value from diversity because they know how to manage each other's inclusion. So not only do they treat people equally well, but they're authentic themselves. They're authentic. They are respectful. They respect themselves for who they are and they respect others for who they are too. And then they seek to really actively seek to make sure they do get this value. And that brings me to the E really, which is about this ability to say, that if we're going to really do well, we've got to be committed to treating people equally well. And by the way, there's a difference between equal treatment and same treatment. We're not looking for same treatment, we're looking for equal treatment, because what good treatment to me looks different to maybe good treatment to Sam. We have different lives, different drivers, different needs. And so we have to figure out, what does it mean to treat one another equally well? And that is a fundamental point, because that is what happens when you actually connect with human heartedness. You connect with the sense of, we need to treat one another equally well. That is phenomenally important. I could tell you statistic after statistic after statistic that would demonstrate to you that if it's a treatment ometer we're looking at, it would seem that Black lives don't matter at all. And that is simply unacceptable. And it's unacceptable any place, but that's an important piece for us to hold on to. So for me then, this 4-point agenda is pretty simple really. It's about saying, could you have the courage to reimagine your corporate governance, your culture and your values? Will you commit not to abdicate responsibility for taking your part? Will you have a new social compact with one another? And will you commit to treating everybody equally well? Because if you dare to do that, then something magical will happen. It will be as though as though angel dust is sprinkled on us, and we'll get to that point where we get to inclusion, where them will finally be us. And when we're there, we're done. So.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for today, Paul. It's been thought-provoking for me as a journey, and I'm sure just seeing that the delegation have shared that 85% of them have found it extremely valuable, that we truly hope that the conversations that you've had today, you take away with you and you continue to have them. As a team, we are extremely passionate about keeping the conversation going, and as we continue to develop our material and our programs as we move forward, this will be part of the conversation that we'll be having with people as they come through our development opportunities. So thank you to all of you for sharing today and being openly honest. The chat interactions were really useful for us to understand where you were at as a delegation and what was landing for you and what you want to take away. As a reminder, we're going to share all these resources with you outside of the webinar today, and we will also be asking you to give us some more feedback, so a deeper dive into what you felt, heard, and your recommendations for our future webinars. So all that's left to say to me again is a huge thank you to you all, and we really look forward to seeing you on the 24th of June for the Our Purpose webinar. Thank you all.